So, liberation, or seeing non-duality, or seeing through duality, whatever we want to call it, is simply seeing that this is empty. In a way, that's it. Having said that, we could all go home now. This is empty, that is empty, that is empty. That's really the open secret, if you like. Now, the problem is that for most of us, most of the time, this doesn't seem to be empty at all. This seems to be extremely full. And if you let me, which you won't, I could stand here and I could talk all day about what this is full of. But I'll just mention a few of the obvious things. You know, this is full of, for example, neuroses. It's full of projections. It's full of anxiety. One of the things it's most full of is time. One of the most unfortunate things for the poor separated being is that it lives in time. So one of the things this is full of, usually, is past and future and all those wonderful good feelings that go with past and future, like guilt and regret and nostalgia and hope, anxiety I've already mentioned. And there's a kind of paradox, and a lot of psychologists have commented on this paradox, that as long as this seems full and is living in separation, then the problem is that what seems to be out there, seems empty. And it's kind of not surprising in a way, because as long as this is full, then what it mostly experiences of out there, it experiences through this kind of thick veil of projections and neuroses and anxiety and nostalgia and hope and all of those other good things. I mean, it's not surprising that one of the most common metaphors throughout history, pretending for a moment that there is such a thing, for the problem that the separated person has, is that we seem to experience, we seem to be here and we seem to experience what's out there through veils. You know, as St. Paul said, you know, once I saw through a glass darkly, you know, a smoky glass. And some psychologists assess that most of us are just about sufficiently aware of what's happening out there to be able to get through the day without being hit by a bus. But apart from that, forget it. Most of what we experience is a projection of our own inner self, let's say. So there's this paradox. As long as this seems full or is full, this is experienced as empty. And because it's experienced as empty, it's experienced as unsatisfying. And in a way, we could say, okay, that's the engine that then runs what seems to be my life. This is unsatisfying, so I set out to make it more satisfying. So there I am, a hamster on a hamster wheel, going round and round and round, chasing what I hope will be more satisfying than this. The problem with that is that there isn't anything other than this, so I'm never going to succeed. So seeing liberation is simply the falling away of that. All of that, everything I've just been talking about, couldn't be simpler. It's just the falling away of all of that. And when that happens, when the sense of separated self that seems to be here collapses, then paradoxically, this then seems to be full. Because it's no longer seen through these veils of separation, veils of paranoia, veils of projection, and so forth. And then it's seen for what it really is, which is a miracle, let's say. When this is seen in its fullness, then there's no need to look for anything else. and so searching ends. And after that what? After that, there's just life happening. So I sometimes try and do a kind of brief summary, if you like. I'll try and do it now, of kind of what it's like when the sense of self collapses. And I've kind of covered the first point already. When the sense of self collapses, it is absolutely seen that this is it. This. When I say this, I mean whatever's arriving in, let's call it perception. This is it. This is the entirety. This is the cosmos. This is the universe, however you want to put it. In a way, I feel that what I'm saying there is in the realm of the bleeding obvious. It's kind of bleeding obvious that whatever arises can only arise in this. I have 2 children. It's a funny phrase, isn't it? I have 2 children. If thoughts, memories, fondness of my 2 children arise, that can only arise in this. There's nowhere else it can arise because there is nowhere else. So that's the first thing. It's seen absolutely when the sense of self collapses that this is it. This is all there is. Now, in a sense, if we leave it there, some people can hear that with an acute sense of existential despair. So the second thing to add is equally important. Once the sense of self has collapsed, taking with it, if not all our neurosis, at least a great deal of our neurosis, then it's seen not just that this is it, but it's also seen that this is enough. And it's like those 3 words, this is enough, I think are probably the real key to what we're talking about all weekend. Because when it's seen that this is enough, how can there be any more searching? I mean, if this is enough, it's enough. We might still climb a Himalaya to sit at the feet of the Guru, or do our worship of our God in whatever way we want to. We might still do that, but hopefully we'll be doing that for entertainment and because we enjoy it, not because we think it's going to get us somewhere other than this, because as this is already enough, there's no need to get anywhere else. So when it's seen that this is enough, this is everything arising out of nothing, there is nothing else but this, then at the very least, a certain amount of relaxation is likely to take place. People sometimes ask me, what I do, which is an exceptionally nosy question, but I always give the same answer. I lead a quiet and blameless life. I drink tea, wander around the park, eat cake. Not necessarily eating cake all the time. So the quest for excitement to lead us somewhere other than this simply ends when it's seen that this is already sufficient. So we have this is it, we have this is enough, and the third really important thing, and I think this also has to do with the end of searching, is it's also seen that this is what it is, and it isn't anything else. It is simply what it is. This is not a story going somewhere in an imagined future. This doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't need to have any meaning because it's sufficient in itself. Once this is seen as enough, how could there be any search for meaning, which by definition exists only in the future, only in an imagined future? So all the stories that the mind constructs to try to entertain itself because it gets so damned bored with feeling that this isn't it, all of those stories collapse. Now we could say that everything is meaningless, Or if you don't like that because it sounds too existential, we could say everything is its own meaning and it doesn't need anything added to it. Usually when I give talks, somebody has the grace to put at least one flower in a jar, sometimes a jam jar. That's been omitted today. But usually I can point to the flower and say, you know, that flower doesn't need any meaning to be a perfect flower. You know, you don't need any added meaning to be a perfect, what's your name?
Jake.
To be a perfect Jake. Jake is already the perfect Jake. I mean, look at Jake doing Jake. You know, doesn't he do it perfectly? Is there anyone in this room who could do Jake better than Jake does? You know, so a flower is a perfect flower. Jake is a perfect Jake. Richard is a perfect Richard. All right? None of these need any added meaning. So everything is seen to be just what it is, and all the stories of meaning die. The searching for spiritual advancement, the searching for God, the searching for the ultimate way to forgive my mother, to save the planet, to save the badgers, I ought to say today, that's topical. It all simply dies, and then there is just what there is. As they say in Zen, before chop wood, after chop wood. As I say, before drink tea, after drink tea. Life becomes very simple. The stories tend to complicate life a lot, the stories of meaning, and they tend to, when they die away, then life tends to become very simple. And there's one last thing I'll say as part of this introduction, and this in a way is the deepest mystery of all. This is the thing that we can say least about, I think. I was here yesterday afternoon and this got touched on, it got mentioned. The last important thing that's seen when the sense of self collapses is that this is all an outpouring of love. It's all love. Whatever phrase we want to use, they're all inadequate. We could say it's all made of love, if you like. This is all an outpouring of unconditional love. The personal mind cannot understand unconditional love because unconditional love is impersonal. The personal mind will tend to turn concepts of unconditional love into yet another way to torture itself. The personal mind will tend to hear messages or communications about unconditional love and turn it into an impossible instruction. It's all unconditional love, therefore I must become unconditionally loving. Now the person cannot do that. The person cannot be unconditionally loving because the person is a person and unconditional love is impersonal. So now the personal mind can construct yet another way to torture itself with its own failure. Another rack or thumbscrew on the spiritual path. And I think that brings to an end the really important things to say about this. That when the sense of self really finally collapses, then what is seen is that this is full of unconditional love. So this is both empty and full. Both of those things are seen in liberation. This is empty. The Buddhists have a really good handle on that. You know, the emptiness out of which everything arises. That is clearly seen. So, emptiness, it's seen that this is empty, but paradoxically, it's also seen that it's full. What's it full of? Unconditional love. It's that brings the searching finally to the end. I get quite a lot of communications from people, and often they're in despair, which is a great sign. If there was a path, despair would be a great signpost on the path, but there is no path. But the despair comes because those individuals have seen that this is empty, and that tends to invoke despair. But when it's seen that this is not just empty, it's also full, then despair tends to die. And that's what brings the seeing, that it's all unconditional love. I sometimes say that what we're talking about here is mysticism. You know, this is the ultimate and in a way the only mystical communication. And what I often say is that a mystic is somebody who knows that everything is unconditional love and they know virtually nothing else. I mean, the mystic is the most ignorant person in the world because they only know that one thing. All the stories have died, the meaning has died. What the mystic sees in emptiness is that almost everything is unknowable. Almost everything is not just unknown, but it's unknowable. But the one thing that the mystic sees is that everything is love. So if you want to know how to repair a Ford Escort gearbox, don't ask a mystic. But if you want to know about unconditional love, if you feel like it, go and see a mystic. It won't do you. It won't do you any good, but it might be entertaining. I think that's enough, actually, for an introduction, so I'll just wait and see if there are questions, discussion. If not, there is.
Morning, Richard.
Morning.
You mentioned that you drink tea, eat cake, and live a blameless life.
I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have said that.
No, okay. But so my question was around the blameless bit, not the tea or the cake. Did you use blameless with any purpose to it? Because then it kind of brought me kind of wandering around karma and what karma means to you.
Just to get a cheap laugh.
Okay. Thank you.
That looks like coffee.
It is coffee. What's that?
Morning. So once the self disappears, once you've got no concept of your ego and you're just existing in pure awareness, consciousness, how do you actually go about day-to-day life? Things like this whole seminar, don't they become sort of irrelevant, pointless, needless? Discussion, talking. To me, it kind of seems as though it'd be, there's no need for it all. You just sit there, like Ramana Maharshi, just do nothing. Just sit there, not talk, not eat. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, a few things come. Firstly, I haven't mentioned the ego, possibly deliberately. It's a tricky, thorny one that if somebody wants to ask about it later, we'll deal with it. Well, what arises in its seen when the sense of a doer, a chooser, someone who's self-responsible here, when that collapses, it's seen that that was always the case. I mean, one of the things you might have come across is that when this is seen in its fullness, if it's seen suddenly, there's often, not always, but there's often a collapse into hysterical laughter. Well, that can be about all sorts of things, but I think one of the things it's mainly about is it is such a joke. You know, that for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, this thought that it was doing everything, that it had to do everything, that if it didn't do everything, nothing would happen. And suddenly it seemed that this was always irrelevant. I mean, that is extraordinarily funny. Or it can be. So, not only did no one come here today to say this or to listen to this, no one here ever studied for their A-levels either, pretending that there was a personal past where that apparently happened. There is no need for anyone to do anything for things to apparently happen. In fact, there is no one who can do anything. As to the other part of what you said, which was something like, well, why not just sit around and do nothing? I invite you to try it. Frankly, unless you're in dreamless sleep, I doubt whether you'll manage it for more than 10 seconds, and if you do, you deserve a medal. Something's always happening. Look, you see there, your eyebrows just went up, your mouth opened. Something's always happening. We can't do nothing. You know, the idea that somehow we can realize that we are not a person by sitting quietly and doing nothing is absolutely absurd. There is one good reason for sitting quietly and doing nothing, and that's if we enjoy it. I do a lot of sitting quietly and doing very little, but only because I enjoy it. I do a lot of staring at walls. I said to somebody some time ago, you know, this thing about it's like watching paint dry, meaning it's boring. I just love watching paint dry. And they said, you know, Richard, I love watching paint that's already dried. So.
Is there any way to prepare for the collapse of self?
Well, if there is, and anybody knows it, whisper it in my ear and I'll become a very wealthy man. Of course not. Of course not. There's no one who can prepare. Nevertheless, all sorts of stories arise about preparations that we can make. That is also partly why there's often laughter. If there's a sudden collapse, the collapse doesn't have to be sudden, but if there's a sudden collapse, there's often laughter, and that's also partly why there's this laughter, because it's just sudden. If the person, like me, for example, had spent a lot of energy, time, money on spiritual paths, following gurus, practices, those kinds of things, the sudden seeing that all of that was completely irrelevant can evoke a lot of laughter. It can also evoke a lot of tears as well, as you realize how much money you gave to the guru who may have also taken not just your bank account, but your wife and your children and your house.
Hi, Richard. You mentioned a couple of times about if the collapse happened suddenly, what would happen? And I was wondering if you could speak to alternative ways that that would apparently happen over time.
Well, there are no rules. All I can tell you is what I've come across. It seems to me this can happen suddenly. It can happen gradually. There are quite a few cases where it happens in childhood, and then it's kind of half forgotten, put into one side, but never really completely forgotten, and then rediscovered later on. And there are rare cases, I think, where the sense of separation simply never arose in the first place. And I can't know this, but I strongly suspect that, for example, J.J. Krishnamurti was one of those, because if you read the description of what he was like when he was about 8 years old and he was discovered by the Theosophists and decided to make him the world leader, it sounds like there was just no real separate sense of self there in the first place, which is, I suspect, why Krishnamurti was so gloriously awful at actually being able to help anybody in any way. Because he didn't understand what all the struggle was about. If you do want help, you won't get any help with this, of course, but if you want help in other matters, like how to forgive your mother, don't go to someone where the sense of self never arose, because they simply won't understand what all that struggle is about.
Because it just seems so personal, everything you experience through the five senses. So how do the five senses change when the self collapses?
Well, they don't. No, I always say if you want your five senses to change, take LSD. There is nothing remotely entertaining about non-duality. If you want entertainment, go to the circus or whatever grabs you. I can't say any more than that, really. The senses, it is perfectly obvious to anyone who's taken hallucinogenic drugs that the senses are provisional, or if you like, that how we experience reality through the senses is totally provisional. It just happens to be the way it is in this right now. A tiny amount of LSD and it will be completely different. So there's no particular reason why the senses, in that sense, why perception in that sense should change. You see, this isn't about seeing things differently in that way. It's not about bliss. It's not about anything in particular. It's not about experience. All of that belongs to the level of experience. What we're talking about, well, what I'm talking about here is that out of which all experience arises. So you have silence and stillness, which is about all you can say about the absolute. So that's not very interesting. And out of that silence and stillness arises this magical manifestation. And they're not different. So it's a little bit misleading for me to say that out of the one arises the other, because they're the same. Out of the absolute arises the relative, and they're the same thing. So there's no reason why perception should change in any way. I mean, it may not. There are no rules. There's no reason why life should get better or worse. It may do. It may not. The sense of self collapses. There's a kind of wow, and then life goes on. If anybody talks about this or says they're talking about this and they're talking about personal experience, forget it. Leave the room. If it's about experience, it doesn't matter how transcendent the experience may be. It doesn't matter if it is an experience of the ultimate transcendental bliss. got nothing to do with this. This is about that out of which all experience arises, including transcendental bliss and despair, and everything else, and tables and puppy dogs.
So hi, I'm here, over here. Hi. So where's the bliss? Where's the bliss?
I'm not hearing it. Did you say, where's the
Where
bliss?
is the bliss?
Where would you like the bliss to be? Where do you find bliss? I sometimes find bliss in the bottom of a cup of coffee. This isn't about bliss. There are many misleading stories that arise on spiritual paths. This is because the mind, faced with its absolute failure to understand what's being said here, the impossibility of understanding what is being said here, the mind makes up stories about it which it can understand. That's the way the mind stays in control. Seeing this emptiness and fullness completely dethrones the mind. I mean, the mind might sort of chatter on after that, probably will, but there's nobody listening anymore. So that's the problem for the mind. How can the mind get back into its throne, get back into control? The only way it can do it when faced with this is to set up a story that there is a path leading to a goal. There's only a certain number of different goals that tend to work. One is, how can I unite with God or please God? One is, how can I finally open my Sahasrara chakra? One is, how can I experience ultimate bliss? And sometimes there's a combination of several of these. It's the way that the mind tries to scrabble its way back into control. Bliss comes, bliss goes. One of the things I often find myself saying is that surely we must recognize that one of the most obvious facts of existence, and again, the Buddhists are really good on this, is impermanence. Yeah? Everything changes. There is nothing, no experience lasts very long. I mean, a thought lasts maybe a few seconds, a cup of coffee might last a few minutes, but impermanence is one of the most obvious facts of existence, let's say. So bliss may come, bliss may go. The idea that somehow there's a state of bliss that I can enter into and be in permanently, not without an intravenous drip. We won't go into what might be at the other end of it.
You say that it's nothing and everything. Isn't that true?
It would be if it was, but it isn't. I'm sorry, the mind cannot cope with this, explain, well, it can cope with it and it can explain it, but it's always wrong. Or like, often, I haven't mentioned this before, but often, not always, but what happens often is that there are, this is going to sound very dualistic, there are two seeings often. There's a kind of initial awakening, which might just last a split second, where the emptiness of everything is seen. Everything is just seen to be completely empty. Often that's followed by despair, and then a phone call to somebody who might be able to talk to you about it. Everything is just seen suddenly to be completely meaningless, but empty, hence the despair. And it doesn't have to be like this, but quite frequently it is. Then later on, there can be another seeing where the emptiness is seen again, but this time the fullness is also seen. And they're the same thing. And I can't put it any clearer than that. And there's no way, even if I could put it clearer than that, there's no way the mind could understand it. But one split second of seeing, and it's understood.
Thank you.
Hi. If the mind is such a nuisance, when you're liberated, wouldn't it be less cumbersome not to be in form? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think that's an invitation to suicide. I'm not sure.
Well, it's not an invitation. I mean, it seems logical that if this thing that's hanging around, making such a noise and troubling you and, you know, trying to get you back into it and all the rest of it, best to be getting rid of it.
Okay. Firstly, and I hope I'm not being picky, I just want to comment on one phrase you used. You said something about when you're liberated. No one is ever liberated. There's no such thing as a liberated person. If anyone claims to be liberated, I would close your wallet, put your credit cards away and leave the room. The mind may or may not be troublesome. We're ignoring, of course, the fact that there is no mind. Let's talk for a moment as if there is a mind, and if we want to talk about that more later, we can. The mind may or may not be troublesome. All I can say is that when this is seen in its fullness, it's likely to become less troublesome. Why is that? Well, partly because what we're talking about here is an energy shift. We're not talking about a change in ideas or a change in beliefs. That's all irrelevant. We're talking about an energy shift during which at least some neurosis and probably quite a lot of neurotic energy goes. It evaporates, and after that the mind is likely to be less troublesome. But even if the mind goes on being troublesome, which it may do, there's nobody in there listening to it anymore. So what?
So do you...
Also, sorry, can I just say one last thing about my possible imminent suicide? The other thing is that, you know, with all of that energy, the energy of the mind either reduced or gone, this tends to be, look, there are no rules about this, but this tends to be enjoyed so much more. You know, there's stillness and silence. There's the depths of the ocean, which are still and silent. And then there's the relative, there's the manifestation, there's the waves on the surface of the ocean, and they're not different, they're the same thing. But the manifestation is really quite interesting compared to stillness and silence. I mean, stillness and silence is okay, I'm not knocking it. But this is rather more colourful. So as long as it's going on, why not enjoy it?
I've got to think about that, thank you.
Thank you. So whilst no one is liberated and enlightened, there is over there a shift, a different seeing than there was before. So when you and others talk about nobody can be enlightened, I know what you're meaning. I think I know what you're meaning, which is there is nobody ever there to be anything. But it does seem a play on words that I'm not sure how helpful it is. Because what I think we're hearing from over there, Richard, is a shift that brings a freedom from the mind. And that is different. You might not want to call it you're enlightened, and I respect that. But you've experienced a shift where you see things and experience things in a freer, happier, maybe, way. You watch the news differently to the rest of us, perhaps, where we see the atrocities and the goings-on, and where I can be caught in between worlds of it's not quite as it seems, and then sometimes really upset about the atrocities to humanity. So I don't know if there's a question here. It's just a sort of bubbling up of the words you're using and not using, and not wanting others to use. But there is a difference, which is why we're listening to you. There seems a difference that you've experienced something.
This isn't just a clever bit of wordplay, this insistence that there is no such thing as a liberated or enlightened person, because the idea that the mind has that there is such a thing gives rise to the most incredible, complex stories that people then build their life round. Not that that matters, but the idea that there is a liberated person leads very quickly to the next idea, which that liberated person can help me to have what they've got. That gives rise to innumerable practices, some of which might be quite helpful on a psychological and emotional level, others of which are rather destructive on a psychological and emotional level, and none of them have anything to do with liberation. So I'm going to go on insisting, when somebody talks about an enlightened person, or even, God forbid, regards me as such, I'm going to go on insisting that there is no such thing, because I think it's important from that point of view.
I hear and respect that you don't want it to be referred to as a person called Richard being enlightened, and I completely like that and get it. However, there is something perhaps useful when you talk about the shift. Yeah, just a shift of seeing. And for me, in my experience, I'm sort of in and out of a shift and then a return back to myself.
Can I just sort of say, there's no one here or there that can do anything about that shift, here or there, and there's especially nobody sitting in a cave halfway up the Himalayas with a very long beard and a very big hat who can do anything about that shift. So if we enjoy going and being with gurus in the mountains, that's absolutely great, that's wonderful. But because we enjoy it, not because they're going to help us with the shift. One of the most confusing things that happens is that, how can I put it, there are no necessary implications in seeing liberation. As the Buddhists say, before chop wood, after chop wood, life simply goes on. But although there are no necessary implications, there are tendencies. I mean, one of the tendencies is that it is quite likely that the mind will quieten down. It is quite likely that there'll be less neurosis, for example. So what the mind does, it gets hold of this and turns it into a story, and basically we could say simply mistakes cause and effect. It reverses them. So we climb halfway up a Himalaya, we find a guru, or we find some chap sitting, or a lady sitting in a cave in robes or whatever, and they seem to be rather peaceful. They seem to have a rather quiet mind. And we then go, I want to be like him, or I want to be like her. In order to become like her, I will quieten my mind. But they didn't become like that by quietening their mind. They have a quiet mind because a shift occurred. We can't bring about the shift by quietening our mind. But if the shift occurs, it's fairly likely that our mind will quieten down. So it's this simple thing the mind does. The mind, in completely failing to understand this, turns it into something that it can understand. You know, whenever you come across a mind that thinks that it's understood this, run a mile, because it will be wrong. So that's what often happens. I mean, the same thing happens with bliss, happiness, for example. They may seem to be rather more contented than I am. Well, perhaps that's because they're sitting in a cave in the Himalayas and they're not having to worry about paying their taxes. I don't know. But it's the same thing. We can mistake cause for effect and effect for cause. We'll never see this by quietening our mind. But if this is seen, the mind may well get quieter. That's very, very frustrating for the mind. This whole thing is incredibly frustrating for the mind. Bear in mind that in everything else that the mind comes across, it can, how can I put it, work on it through effort. You know, if I want to learn German, the mind can work on it through effort, and I'll learn German. If I want to learn how to take a gearbox out of a Ford Cortina, the mind can work on that through effort and learn to do it. It seems totally unjust and totally unfair to the mind that this is the one thing, the one thing that really matters in a way, the mind can't get any purchase on. You know, it's so frustrating. A kind of mantra that I hear quite often in the talks I give, or people phone me up, it's so unfair. It is. As far as the mind's concerned, it's completely unfair. You know, one chap meditates for 30 years and maybe performs a rati to the guru every night. Nothing happens. Somebody else never even heard the word liberation. They're cycling down a country road one day and suddenly there's nobody cycling down the country road. Nevertheless, cycling down the country road is still happening, because that's all we're talking about. That's all we're talking about. Somebody gets on a bicycle, cycles down a country lane, and then suddenly there's no one cycling down the country lane, yet cycling down the country lane is still happening. That's it. That's all we're talking about. By the way, if anybody didn't recognize that reference, it's to Nathan Gill, who wrote a very good book about this.
Thank you, that was great.
You sort of just answered the question I was going to ask, actually. So it's just going to happen or not happen.
Oh, it'll happen. I guarantee that. It might be at death, but it'll happen.
Right.
I quote I quote somebody in my first, an extraordinarily good book. I really recommend it if you haven't yet bought it. Please don't read a copy owned by a friend or borrow it from the library. Buy it off Amazon. I think I get 10 pence a copy for that. I quote somebody in there who says, well, I'll use his, the way he put it, although it's not absolutely orthodox non-duality language, but never mind. He said, everyone's enlightened when they're dead. It's just more chic to be enlightened while we're alive.
Hi, Richard. Hi, I'm here. I think I'm here. I don't know. Would it be fair to say that actually the shift happens all the time anyway to all of us apparent people, in that, you know, someone, for quite a tough period of my life, someone introduced me to CBT and techniques like that, inquiry techniques and CBT and so on. And I just found that whenever I was suffering, you know, it was usually because I was telling some story. In fact, it was always because I was telling some story. And if I just sat down and examined it on paper, the suffering would disappear, and I'm just back in the now. Well, I'm not back in the now. There just is the now without any story or fantasy for a moment until it happens all over again. So would it be fair to say that this idea of the shift as a future event that's happened to you, I mean, in a sense, it happens to all us apparent people all the time. Is that a fair comment, or I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that?
I think CBT, I'm not going to comment. I don't know if you mentioned self-inquiry. I won't comment on that because I don't know enough about it. I think CBT can be extremely helpful for a person trying to live a life. You know, as a psychotherapeutic approach, it's got legs, which maybe some other psychotherapeutic approach doesn't have. Clearly, it's got nothing to do with what we're talking about here. I hope that's clear by now. In terms of what you're talking about, of course, for all of us, there are times in the day when we're not there. The most obvious example of that is in dreamless sleep. We're very much not there in dreamless sleep. But even in waking mode, there are times when we're not there, and there may be little moments when there's a kind of mini realization. There isn't really anything very much to say about that. You know, I'm going to use this phrase, it's a bit dodgy, but I'll use it. When the final shift happens, and this is seen not just to be empty, this and this, not just to be empty, but also full, that's when it's all over. What's the it that's all over? It's impossible to describe, just the idea that there was ever somebody here living a life, who had a life to live, who had responsibility and choice and decisions to make and all the things that go with that, like regret and hope and guilt and fear and all of that stuff. And then after that, there's just life happening. Is that any different? Well, it may be. It probably will be. It may not be. It may be just the same as before. It will just be seen that all of this is happening, but it's not happening to anyone, and it's not happening for anyone, and there's no one here or there or there or there who needs to do anything about it. Nobody needed to come here today. In fact, nobody did come here today. This is simply what's arising. This is simply what's happening. And my suggestion, going back, I can see the clock going round, and going back to where I started from, my suggestion is, in a way, it's only when it's seen that there's no one doing this that, in a way, we could say life begins. And that's an extremely dodgy phrase to use, I know. It's a time-bound phrase. It contradicts everything I've said in the last hour. But it doesn't matter.
Thank
So
you.
all I can say is, you know, when it's seen, it's seen. When that fullness is seen, it's seen. And that's what finally puts an end to all the searching. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, it's, can I ask another question? So so this temporary shift that I'm talking about, I mean, is it almost like you could see the illusory self as a bad habit? Because that just kind of comes back again. And, you know, until the next time when I'd put down on paper my thoughts and then suddenly think, oh, there's actually nothing to worry about. And do you see what I mean? Can you just see it as a bad habit that could one day drop away?
There are all sorts of things that are similar to what we're talking about, and one of the things that obviously comes to my mind is what sportsmen sometimes talk about, being in the zone, for example. You know, the Zen archer, that sort of idea. There's no archer, there's no arrow, there's no button. That's when it reaches its target. And sportsmen talk about being in the zone, that kind of emptiness when, you know, really they get the shot in because there's no one there. Yeats even has this in a poem of his where he talks about a dancer and the dancer disappearing, and there is just the dance. He says, how can we tell the dancer from the dance? I think that's probably pretty similar to what we're talking about, but what I notice is that when individuals report, let's call it the final seeing of this, the seeing of this in its fullness and not just in its emptiness, it tends to have an I'm going into dangerous ground here, but I'm going to use this phrase anyway. It tends to have an extraordinary transformatory power because love is seen. That's why it tends to have such an extraordinary transformative power. And I feel I have to add as a safety insurance thing, and it might not, but it does tend to, let's say, inform the whole of the rest of what I laughingly call my life. Now, it seems to me that when sportsmen talk about being in the zone, it doesn't have that effect. And I might be wrong. I'm not a sportsman. I don't know. I mean, this can come about in so many different ways, what we're talking about. There are absolutely no rules. Does that kind of answer the question? Yeah.
It's the last you'll hear from me, but so you were saying a minute ago that there's nothing you can do to bring about.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's no one who can do anything. That is completely different. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. So, I mean, in Buddhist practice, the meditative, path, observing, just awareness, I've noticed that that's brought about a certain amount of shifts. So there are things that one can do, sorry to use a very dualistic phrase there, to bring these shifts about. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Absolutely not. No, I don't agree. I think there are things we can do which can be extraordinarily useful to this psychophysical organism in making us happier, better adjusted, quietening neurotic thoughts. If someone has a head full of disturbing, painful and neurotic thoughts, then entirely the sensible thing to do is to do something about that. Mindfulness is a practice which is excellent for dealing with that. That's why mindfulness is being used so much in the NHS now, for example. So there's mindfulness, there's meditation, we've already mentioned CBT. We're living actually in an age where there are an extraordinary number of wonderful techniques for dealing with inner turmoil, and that's what they do. They deal with inner turmoil. Now, the evidence in terms of what we're talking about is completely obvious. Sometimes people practice Zen meditation for 20 years and there's liberation, and sometimes they do that and there isn't. And sometimes people drink beer in the bar of a dog track for 20 years and there's liberation, and sometimes there isn't. And it's totally unfair to the mind The mind absolutely hates this. If you come across a statement about this from a speaker or in a book or on a film which the mind likes, I would be highly suspicious of it, because it's probably wrong. The mind is dethroned by this, and the mind's whole purpose is to stay on the throne. And as I said before, I've used the word mind many times this morning. Of course, we should remind ourselves that there is no such thing. There's a thought flow, if you like. There's a perception flow, an ever-changing flow of perception. The problem for the separated person, the one who lives in separation, is that the thought flow is usually so energized, and the thoughts tend to come so thick and fast that it creates the impression that there must be something solid from which these thoughts flow. But look for the mind and you'll never find it, just as look for the person and you'll never find it. People have been looking for the person for at least a few thousand years, possibly for tens of thousands of years. No one's ever found it because it isn't there. But if you have a problem arising out of poor attachment to your mother when you were 1 year old, I would seriously suggest you consider CBT or something like that. Very helpful indeed, very helpful.
Just an add-on, just because it seems plainly aware to me, having been on a number of retreats and experiencing stuff at the end of those retreats, that my day-to-day life seems to hinder the experiences, which admittedly are not. The experiences are only experiences, and they're very dualistic. But at the time, they aren't. It's a dropping. It's an awareness. It's a pure conscious awareness with no attachment, no I, no thought that I am this person. And this only seems to arise after intense silent meditation ongoing for a couple of weeks. Vipassana seems to have brought this shift about more times than anything else. So I can only deduce that that shift can occur thanks to the practice. I don't know.
That's entirely logical, and the mind loves that stuff. It sounds like you benefit from Vipassana. That's great. I mean, I think what we're talking about here in a way isn't rocket science. I think there's only one intelligent thing to say about practices, which is that if you enjoy them or find them useful, do them. Why not? At some point it may be seen there's no one doing them. But the practices can be extremely useful for the psychophysical organism. Meanwhile, the bummer, as it were, is that somebody else who's never even heard the word of Vipassana is cycling down a country lane, and suddenly they're not there, and there's just cycling down a country lane. I have somebody who comes to my talks in London regularly, and one of the things he says is it's just so unfair. Well, yeah, to the mind it is, but this isn't about... Fairness is a construct of the mind. This isn't about the mind, it's not about fairness. This is so far beyond the mind is just left gasping and giving up. But practice is great if you find practice great. If you find practice torture, then it's torture. As I say, it's not rocket science. If it's useful or enjoyable, do it. If it's useful and enjoyable, you've hit the jackpot.
I get a bit confused when we're talking about things like meditation and Vipassana, and you say it's a good thing to do. But on the other hand, you're saying there isn't anybody in there who's choosing in the first place. So do you understand my confusion?
I didn't say that it was a good thing to do, which would be to make a judgment based on I don't know what. I said that if you find them useful or enjoyable, then why not do them? And if you find them both, that's great. And at some point it may be seen that there is no one doing them. And that includes, it may be seen at some point, that there is no one who ever chose to do them. But if Vipassana arises, Vipassana arises. If it's torture, it's probably a good idea to stop. If it's enjoyable, it's probably a good idea to go on. Why not? Why not?
That implies a choice.
Well, the problem is language. It's impossible to talk about this in language, but we have to try. I try to make this communication as clear as possible without torturing language to the extent that it becomes unbearable. So that's why that sounds like there's a choice. It sounds like it, that's not what I'm saying. It's just that it would be too painful for you all if I qualified every phrase that I use in the way that really I should do. So is it clear that there is no choice? Vipassana arises, or drinking beer arises. Maybe if you're lucky, both arise, but probably not at the same time, but who knows? Thank you. Thank you.